Hello everyone and welcome. What we're about to do today is, well, it's an ambitious undertaking. We're going to embark on a journey, a long and often brutal one, through what I believe are some of the most significant wars in the story of humankind. Think of this not as a lecture, but as a conversation, a flight of the imagination where we try to put ourselves in the sandals, the boots, the bare feet of the people who lived through these cataclysms. We'll be hopping across continents and centuries, from the bronze-clad warriors clashing under a Mediterranean sun to the drone operators of the 21st century. It's a vast, sprawling tapestry of conflict, and we're going to pull on some of its most pivotal threads. Now, let me be clear right from the start. This is not and cannot be an exhaustive list. To try and cover every war, every skirmish, every rebellion that has shaped our world in a single video would be, well, it would be madness. The human capacity for organized violence is, unfortunately, almost limitless. Instead, what we have here is a curated selection, a highlights reel, if you will, of conflicts that I think had earth-shattering consequences, conflicts that redrew maps, toppled empires, and forged the very world we inhabit today. We're looking for the turning points, the moments where history held its breath and then exhaled in a direction that changed everything. So, I invite you to settle in. This is a big picture overview, a 30,000-foot view of human conflict. We're going to be moving fast, but the goal is to connect the dots, to see the echoes of ancient choices in modern dilemmas. It's a story of courage and cruelty, of genius and folly, of immense suffering and incredible resilience. It is, in many ways, the story of us. So let's begin our journey back, way back, to a time of gods and heroes, where the line between myth and history is blurred by the fog of war. When you try to peer back into the deepest parts of recorded history, what you find is often inseparable from legend. The Trojan War, was it a real event? A 10-year siege over a beautiful queen? Or perhaps a more mundane but no less brutal conflict over trade routes and resources? Homer gives us the poetry, the larger-than-life heroes like Achilles and Hector. But the archaeologists, like Schliemann digging in the soil of modern-day Turkey, they find evidence, layers of destruction, signs of a great city that burned. It's that blend of myth and reality that makes it so compelling. It represents a foundational story for Western civilization, a tale of honor, fate, and the horrific cost of war that has resonated for 3,000 years. Then history steps out of the shadows and into the light, the Greco-Persian wars. This is a David versus Goliath story on a geopolitical scale. The mighty Persian Empire, the superpower of its day, stretching from India to Libya, decides to swallow the fractious, argumentative little city-states of Greece. And you think, this is a foregone conclusion. How can they possibly stand? But then you get the Battle of Marathon, where Athenian hoplites charge the Persian lines. You get the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, a glorious defeat that becomes an immortal legend of sacrifice. It's a clash of civilizations, of political ideologies, the centralized monarchy versus the nascent idea of freedom. The Greek victory was not just a military one, it was an ideological one that allowed the golden age of Athens to flourish and laid the groundwork for Western philosophy, democracy, and art. But what happens when the victors turn on each other? That's the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War. Athens versus Sparta, the cerebral naval power against the austere land-based military society. Thucydides, the great historian who lived through it, wrote the definitive account, and it's a masterclass in political realism. He shows how fear, honor, and interest drive nations to ruin. This wasn't a war against a foreign other, this was a Greek civil war, a long, grinding, and vicious conflict that tore the heart out of Hellas. It's a cautionary tale for the ages, the hubris of a great power, the dangers of political polarization, and the way war can poison a society from within, leaving it weak and vulnerable for the next conqueror. And that next conqueror would come from the north. But the next great rivalry would emerge from across the sea, the Punic Wars, Rome versus Carthage. This is, for my money, one of the greatest rivalries in all of history. Two titans fighting for control of the Mediterranean. It's a struggle that spans over a century, a multi-generational death match. You have three distinct wars, each with its own character. The first is a naval struggle for Sicily. The third is the brutal final annihilation of Carthage, a city ploughed into the earth and salted. But the second Punic War is the stuff of legend. It is the story of one man, Hannibal Barca, who embodies military genius. Think about the sheer audacity of it. Hannibal decides he can't beat the Roman navy, so he'll take the war to them. He marches an army complete with war elephants from Spain over the Pyrenees and then, impossibly, over the Alps into Italy itself. It's one of the greatest logistical and strategic feats in military history. For over a decade, he rampages through the Roman heartland, inflicting devastating defeats like the Battle of Cannae, where he encircled and annihilated a much larger Roman army. It's a textbook example of tactical brilliance still studied in military academies today. Hannibal became the bogeyman for Rome, the monster parents would use to scare their children. But Rome was different. Any other power would have collapsed after defeats like Cannae. But Rome's strength wasn't just in its legions, it was in its societal resilience, its political will, its near bottomless pool of manpower. They refused to break. They adopted the strategy of Fabius the Delayer, avoiding direct battle and waging a war of attrition. They learned, they adapted, and eventually they produced a general, Scipio Africanus, who could match Hannibal's genius. He took the war to Carthage's doorstep in Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home, where he was finally defeated at the Battle of Zama. The Punic Wars decided who would dominate the Mediterranean and, by extension, the known world. Rome's victory set it on the path to empire. And what does a republic do once it becomes an empire? It expands. Enter Julius Caesar and the Gallic Wars. On the surface, this is a series of campaigns to subdue the various tribes of Gaul, modern-day France, but it's so much more than that. It's a political tool for Caesar, a way to build a veteran army loyal only to him, to gain immense wealth and to write his own legend in his. He presents himself as the calm, decisive Roman general bringing civilization to the barbarians. But when you read between the lines, you see the brutal reality. This was a war of conquest that may have killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. It was a demographic catastrophe. And it culminates in the epic siege of Alesia, where Caesar, facing a massive Gallic relief army, builds a wall around his own siege lines, a fortification facing both inwards and outwards. It's a feat of military engineering that is simply mind-boggling. The victory in Gaul gave Caesar the power to march on Rome, destroy the Republic, and lay the foundations for the Roman Empire, an entity that would define the Western world for 1,000 years. As the ghost of Rome faded and Europe fractured into 1,000 pieces, a new unifying and often dividing force emerged: faith. And nothing exemplifies the collision of faith and violence more than the Crusades. It begins in 1095 with a sermon by Pope Urban II. He calls on the knights of Christendom to cease their endless squabbling, to stitch a cross onto their tunics, and to march thousands of miles to reclaim the Holy Land from Islamic rule. It's a truly stunning moment. An entire continent mobilizes for an ideological goal. The First Crusade is, against all odds, a shocking success, culminating in the brutal capture of Jerusalem. But that's just the beginning of a story that spans 2 centuries. The subsequent Crusades are a messy, complex affair. There are moments of piety and moments of pure, naked greed. The Fourth Crusade is a perfect example of how the ideal became corrupted. The Crusaders, unable to pay their Venetian transport, get diverted and end up sacking not a Muslim city, but the Christian city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. It's a betrayal that shatters the Eastern Roman Empire and leaves a scar on Orthodox Catholic relations that has never fully healed. The Crusades were a military failure in the long run, as the Holy Land was ultimately retaken by Muslim forces like the Great Saladin. But their impact was immense. They fostered trade, transferred knowledge, and solidified the idea of a Christendom in opposition to another, a dynamic that would shape European identity for centuries. While knights were fighting in the Holy Land, another epic conflict was brewing back in Europe, a dynastic struggle that would define the late Middle Ages, the 100 Years' War. Now, the name is a bit of a misnomer. It wasn't one continuous war, but a series of conflicts between England and France that dragged on for 116 years. It starts as a feudal dispute over who has the rightful claim to the French throne. The English kings, with their Norman ancestry, had a plausible, if complicated, claim. What makes this war so fascinating is its evolution. It starts as a war of mounted chivalric knights and ends as something much more modern. The English introduce a game-changing technology, the longbow. At battles like Crécy and Agincourt, English yeomen, commoners, armed with these powerful weapons, mow down the flower of French nobility. A well-aimed piece of sharpened wood and goose feather could defeat a lifetime of training and a fortune in plate armor. This had profound social implications. It challenged the very foundations of the feudal system, where military power was the exclusive domain of the aristocracy. The war saw incredible swings of fortune. The English under Henry V came tantalizingly close to winning it all. Then, just when France seems broken, on the verge of total collapse, a figure straight out of a storybook appears, Joan of Arc. A teenage peasant girl who claims to hear the voice of God, she inspires the demoralized French army, lifts the siege of Orleans and turns the tide of the war. Her story is incredible, a testament to the power of faith and charisma. Though she was captured and burned at the stake by the English and their allies, her martyrdom galvanized French resistance. The war also helped forge a sense of national identity in both England and France. People began to see themselves not just as subjects of a local lord, but as English or French, and the French, using new technologies like gunpowder artillery to smash English castles, eventually drove the invaders out, consolidating the power of the French monarchy. And what of the English when they finally limped home, defeated and disillusioned? Well, a nation that has been geared for foreign war for over a century doesn't just find peace overnight. The vast network of powerful armed nobles accustomed to plunder and battle in France now turned their ambitions inward. This sets the stage for the Wars of the Roses. This was not a foreign war, but a brutal dynastic civil war between two rival branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. It was a deeply personal and treacherous conflict, characterized by betrayals, summary executions, and kings being deposed and murdered. Battles like Towton were fought in a snowstorm, were perhaps the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. It was a war that tore the English aristocracy apart. Noble families were wiped out, their lands and titles changing hands with each swing of the political pendulum. For 30 years, England was convulsed by this struggle for power, a story immortalized and heavily dramatized by William Shakespeare. The conflict finally ended at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, where Richard III was killed and Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, took the throne as Henry VII. He married a Yorkist princess, symbolically uniting the two houses and founding the Tudor dynasty, which would usher England out of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, the nature of warfare began to change dramatically. This is the early modern era, a period of transition where new technologies and new political ideas created a cauldron of conflict. The Italian wars are a perfect starting point. Italy, wealthy and culturally vibrant from the Renaissance, but politically fragmented into competing city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan, became the glittering prize for the newly consolidated monarchies of France and Spain. It was a playground for ambition. These wars were a laboratory for new military tactics. You see the decline of the heavily armored knight and the rise of professional infantry armies wielding pikes and early firearms, the arquebus. It was a messy, multi-sided conflict where alliances shifted like sand. One year the Pope might be allied with France against Spain, the next he might be allied with Spain against France. It was a brutal education for the Italian states, whose wealth and sophistication were no match for the raw military power of these new nation-states. The Italian wars ultimately saw Spain emerge as the dominant power in Italy and for a time in all of Europe, but they also spread Renaissance ideas northward and showcased the lethal effectiveness of gunpowder on the battlefield. If the Italian wars were about dynastic ambition, the next great European cataclysm was about something much deeper: God. The 30 Years' War is one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. It begins in 1618 with a bizarre event in Prague called the defenestration, where Protestant nobles throw two Catholic imperial officials out of a castle window. They survive, but the event sparks a religious war within the Holy Roman Empire. a patchwork of states in Central Europe. It pits Protestant princes against the Catholic Habsburg emperor. But what starts as a religious war quickly metastasizes. Soon outside powers are drawn in, seeking to take advantage of the chaos. Lutheran Sweden, under its military genius King Gustavus Adolphus, intervenes on the Protestant side, introducing new, highly effective mobile artillery and aggressive infantry tactics. Catholic France, in a masterful display of, intervenes on the Protestant side as well, not for religious reasons, but to check the power of its great rival, the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria. The war becomes a continent-spanning struggle for political dominance. For 30 years, armies crisscross Germany, living off the land, which is a euphemism for plundering, raping and murdering. The devastation is almost unimaginable. Some areas of Germany lose over half their population to war, famine and disease. The war finally burns itself out, and the exhausted parties sign the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This treaty is a landmark in world history. It establishes the principle of state sovereignty, the idea that each state, regardless of its size, has the right to control its own internal affairs, including its religion, without outside interference. This is the bedrock of our modern international system. The 30 Years' War was a horrific catastrophe, but it fundamentally reshaped the political map of Europe, broke the back of religious wars as the primary driver of conflict, and gave birth to the modern state system. With religion taking a back seat, the stage was set for raw, naked power politics. The 18th century was dominated by these kinds of conflicts, and perhaps the best example, what some have called the First World War, is the 7 Years' War. This was a truly global conflict. While Frederick the Great's Prussia was fighting for its very survival against a coalition of Austria, France and Russia in Europe, a much larger struggle was taking place between Great Britain and France. They fought in North America, where it was called the French and Indian War. They fought in the Caribbean over lucrative sugar islands. They fought in India, where commercial trading companies fielded their own armies. They fought on the high seas all over the world. The stakes were immense. Who would become the dominant global colonial power? The British, with their powerful Royal Navy and their ability to project financial and military power across the oceans, ultimately triumphed. The results were staggering. France was ejected from North America, ceding Canada to Britain. British influence in India became paramount, laying the groundwork for the British Raj. Britain emerged from the war as the world's undisputed premier colonial empire, a position it would hold for over 150 years. But victory came at a cost. The massive debt Britain incurred fighting the war would lead it to impose new taxes on its American colonies. And that would lead directly to another war. The seeds of the American Revolution were sown on the battlefields of the 7 Years' War. Before that revolution, however, Europe was convulsed by another major dynastic struggle at the beginning of the century, the War of the Spanish Succession. This conflict encapsulates the clockwork-like balance of power politics that defined the era. The King of Spain, Charles II, died without an heir, and in his will he left the entire vast Spanish Empire, Spain itself, its Italian possessions, and its immense colonies in the Americas, to the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. This threatened to create a Franco-Spanish superpower that would completely dominate Europe. The other powers, led by Great Britain, the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire, formed a grand alliance to prevent this. What followed was over a decade of widespread warfare, from the fields of Flanders to the waters of the Mediterranean. It was the age of the Duke of Marlborough, one of Britain's greatest generals, whose victories at battles like Blenheim are legendary. The war was bloody and expensive, a testament to how the fear of... So, the turn of the 19th century, well, it's really dominated by one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars, you see, were kind of the culmination of the French Revolution. Those ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity, which, honestly, had terrified the old monarchies of Europe, were now carried right across the continent on the bayonets of Napoleon's Grande Armée. It was a clash of ideologies, for sure, but also a clash of a new kind of warfare, and Napoleon was, without a doubt, a master of it. He didn't bother with the slow, formal, siege-based warfare of the 18th century. No, he sought outright annihilation. He moved his armies with unprecedented speed, lived off the land, and concentrated his forces to crush his enemies in decisive battles. Austerlitz, for example, which was really his masterpiece. For over a decade, Napoleon was the master of Europe. He redrew the map, abolished the thousand-year-old Holy Roman Empire, and, well, placed his relatives on the thrones of conquered nations. Of course, he was opposed by a series of shifting coalitions, almost always financed by British gold and protected by the Royal Navy. The British, in fact, won the decisive naval battle of Trafalgar, which ensured Napoleon could never invade Britain. His ambition, though, was absolutely limitless, and honestly, that was his downfall. His disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, where the vast distances and the brutal winter destroyed his Grand Army, was really the beginning of the end. A renewed coalition of European powers finally defeated him at the Battle of Leipzig and, after his brief return from exile, for good at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The Napoleonic Wars were, in a word, transformative. They spread the ideals of the French Revolution, sparking the fires of nationalism across Europe. The concept of a war fought not by professional mercenaries but by a nation in arms, a citizen army, was born. The scale of the fighting was, well, just unprecedented, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Congress of Vienna, which met to pick up the pieces, tried to turn back the clock and restore the old monarchies, but frankly, the genie of nationalism and liberalism was out of the bottle. The 19th century would be a story of those forces pushing against the old order. Now, half a world away, a different kind of nation was facing its own existential crisis. The American Civil War was the brutal, bloody crucible in which the modern United States was forged. It was a war fought over the fundamental question of whether a nation conceived in liberty could endure half slave and half free, and in many ways it was the first truly modern war. It saw the use of railroads to move troops and supplies on a massive scale. It saw the telegraph used for instant communication between generals and their political leaders. There was trench warfare that prefigured World War I, ironclad warships clashing at sea, and even the use of observation balloons. But beyond the technology, it was the sheer ferocity and scale that was just shocking. This wasn't a war fought by small professional armies over dynastic succession. It was a total war between two societies. The Union, with its industrial might and larger population, fought the Confederacy, which had a rich military tradition and was fighting on its home turf. The battles, Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, produced casualty lists that were honestly staggering, unimaginable to previous generations of Americans. The war ended slavery, preserved the Union, and established the supremacy of the federal government. But it left deep and lasting scars on the American soul and a legacy of racial inequality that the country is, well, still grappling with today. While America was tearing itself apart, a conflict of even greater scale was raging in China. The Taiping Rebellion is, without exaggeration, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, yet it's often overlooked in the West. It was a bizarre and catastrophic civil war. It was led by a man named Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil service examinee who, after having a nervous breakdown and reading some Christian pamphlets, declared that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth to establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. What followed was anything but peaceful. His movement gathered millions of followers, a mix of true believers and peasants fed up with the corruption and weakness of the ruling Qing dynasty. The Taiping army swept across southern China, capturing the great city of Nanjing and making it their capital. For 14 years, China was ravaged by a total war of unimaginable brutality. The Taiping ideology was, well, a strange mix of Christianity, utopianism, and traditional Chinese ideas. They were social revolutionaries. They outlawed opium, advocated for land redistribution, and declared men and women equal, at least in theory. The Qing government, on the verge of collapse, was eventually forced to rely on Western military assistance and newly formed regional armies to slowly, bloodily crush the rebellion. The death toll is staggering, estimated to be at least 20 million people, perhaps more. It was a demographic catastrophe that severely weakened the Qing dynasty and left China vulnerable to further foreign encroachment. The 19th century was also the high watermark of European colonialism, and this inevitably led to anti-colonial conflicts. These were often deeply asymmetrical wars, pitting industrial European armies against indigenous forces. The outcomes were frequently one-sided, as in the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan. where a British-Egyptian army with Maxim guns and artillery annihilated a massive Mahdist army. But these conflicts were not always so straightforward. The Zulu War in South Africa, for example, saw disciplined Zulu warriors, armed primarily with spears and shields, inflict a stunning defeat on a British column at the Battle of Isandlwana, a real shock to the Victorian sense of imperial invincibility. In places like Afghanistan, the British found themselves bogged down in grueling guerrilla wars, learning the hard lesson that conquering a country and controlling it are two very different things. These conflicts, while often seen as minor savage wars from a European perspective, were existential struggles for the people being colonized and in many ways laid the groundwork for the decolonization movements of the 20th century. The 20th century, well, it was really born in violence. The stage was set by a complex web of alliances, a frantic arms race, and honestly, some pretty intense nationalistic and imperial rivalries. All it needed was a spark. That spark came in Sarajevo in 1914 with the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. A regional crisis in the Balkans quickly escalated as the alliance system, the Triple Entente of France, Britain and Russia, versus the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, dragged the great powers of Europe into the abyss. Everyone thought it would be a short, glorious war over by Christmas. They could not have been more wrong. What they got was World War I, the Great War, the so-called war to end all wars. It was a cataclysm that absolutely shattered the old world. The romanticized idea of warfare died a horrible death in the mud of the Western Front. This was a new kind of industrial slaughter. Trench warfare, machine guns, massive artillery bombardments, poison gas. These technologies created a stalemate of unprecedented lethality. For 4 years, millions of men lived like rats in elaborate networks of trenches, periodically being ordered over the top to charge across a no-man's land of shell craters and barbed wire into a hail of machine gun fire. Battles like the Somme and Verdun became, synonymous with meaningless slaughter, where hundreds of thousands of lives were exchanged for just a few miles of blasted earth. The war was a global conflict. Soldiers from Canada, Australia, India and Africa fought and died for the British and French empires. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening up fronts in the Middle East. Japan, an ally of Britain, seized German colonies in the Pacific. The United States, initially neutral, was eventually drawn into the conflict in 1917, and its industrial might and fresh manpower tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. The war finally ended in November 1918, but it left a scar across the face of Europe. Entire generations of young men were wiped out. 4 empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian and Ottoman, lay in ruins. The old order was gone forever. One of those collapsing empires, Russia, imploded into a conflict of its own. The strains of World War I were just too much for the autocratic and inefficient Tsarist regime. In 1917, the Tsar was overthrown, but the provisional government that replaced him made the fatal mistake of trying to continue the war. This created an opening for the Bolsheviks, a radical communist faction led by Vladimir Lenin, to seize power in a coup. This did not bring peace. Instead, it plunged Russia into a vicious and chaotic civil war. It was the Reds, the Bolsheviks, against the Whites, a loose and disunited coalition of monarchists, liberals and moderate socialists, who were in turn aided by foreign powers like Britain, France, Japan and the United States, all of whom feared the spread of communism. The Russian Civil War was fought across the vast expanse of the former Russian Empire. It was a war of incredible cruelty, characterized by mass executions, pogroms and the Red Terror and White Terror. It was a multi-sided free-for-all, with nationalist movements in places like Ukraine and the Caucasus, also fighting for their independence. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks, with their unified command, ruthless methods and control of the industrial heartland, triumphed. They established the Soviet Union, the world's first communist state. The Civil War was a foundational event for the USSR, creating a paranoid, militarized and authoritarian state that saw itself as a besieged fortress in a hostile capitalist world. This mindset would shape Soviet foreign policy for the next 70 years. In the 1930s, another country became a testing ground for a future global conflict. The Spanish Civil War was, on the surface, a struggle between the democratically elected leftist Republican government and a nationalist rebellion led by General Francisco Franco. But it quickly became an ideological proxy war for the great powers of Europe. Franco's nationalists received extensive military support, troops, tanks and aircraft from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. They wanted to see a friendly fascist regime in Spain and, more importantly, to test their new weapons and tactics. The Republicans received more limited aid from the Soviet Union and international brigades of foreign volunteers, idealists, communists and adventurers who came from all over the world to fight against fascism. The war was brutal and became a symbol of the great ideological struggle of the age, fascism versus communism versus democracy. It was immortalized in the works of writers like George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway, and in Picasso's masterpiece Guernica, which depicted the horrific bombing of a civilian town by German aircraft flying for Franco. The nationalists' eventual victory in 1939 established a right-wing dictatorship in Spain that would last for decades. But more significantly, the Spanish Civil War was a dress rehearsal for World War II. It showed the world the devastating power of modern air power against civilian targets, and demonstrated the aggressive ambitions of Hitler and Mussolini, an ambition the Western democracies seemed, well, unwilling or unable to confront. While Europe was sliding towards war, a massive conflict had already erupted in Asia. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937, though its roots go back to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The Empire of Japan, driven by a militaristic ideology and a desire for resources and regional dominance, launched a full-scale invasion of China. This was a war of staggering scale and brutality. The Japanese military was far better equipped and trained than the fractured Chinese forces, which were divided between the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek and the communists of Mao Zedong. The Japanese advance was marked by horrific atrocities, most infamously the rape of Nanking, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and unarmed soldiers were murdered in a matter of weeks. Despite the initial Japanese successes, China refused to surrender. The vastness of the country and the sheer resilience of its people bogged the Japanese army down in a grinding war of attrition that they simply could not win. This war in China is often seen as the true beginning of World War II in Asia, a conflict that would eventually merge with the war in Europe to create a truly global conflagration. If World War I was a cataclysm that broke the old world, World War II was honestly a moral and physical abyss that threatened to swallow civilization itself. It was, without question, the largest and deadliest conflict in human history. This was a total war where the distinction between soldier and civilian blurred and then vanished entirely. The war in Europe began in September 1939 with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, using the new tactic of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which combined concentrated armoured spearheads with overwhelming air support. German forces crushed Poland in just a matter of weeks. Then, after a period of quiet known as the Phony War, Hitler unleashed his war machine on Western Europe in 1940, conquering Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries and, most shockingly, France, in a stunning 6-week campaign. Britain now stood alone, led by the defiant Winston Churchill. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over southern England in the summer of 1940, was a crucial turning point. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, managed to fight off the German Luftwaffe, preventing a German invasion, but Britain was still under siege, facing the Blitz, the nightly bombing of its cities, and a naval blockade from German U-boats in the Atlantic. The war was a global chess match. It was fought in the deserts of North Africa, in the mountains of Greece and the Balkans, and across the world's oceans. The entire character of the war changed irrevocably in June 1941, when Hitler, in an act of supreme hubris, launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This opened the Eastern Front, which would become the main theatre of the war and the site of almost unimaginable savagery and scale. This was not just a war of conquest for the Nazis, it was a war of extermination, an ideological struggle against Judeo-Bolshevism. The fighting was on a scale that dwarfs almost anything else in history. Millions of men were locked in a death struggle from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Battles like Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army was encircled and annihilated, and Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, were turning points that bled the German army white. The vast majority of German military casualties in the war occurred on the Eastern Front. While this titanic struggle was raging in the East, the war became truly global on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At the same time, Japan launched attacks across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This brought the industrial might of the United States into the war. The Pacific War was primarily a naval and air conflict, characterized by carrier battles like Midway, where the US Navy crippled the Japanese fleet in a decisive victory just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. This was followed by a brutal island-hopping campaign where US Marines and Army soldiers fought their way across heavily fortified islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima and Okinawa against a Japanese enemy who often fought to the last man. Behind the front lines, the war took on its most horrific dimension. The Holocaust, the Nazi regime's systematic industrial-scale genocide of 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims, including Roma, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war and disabled people, is an event of singular evil in human history. It was the chillingly logical conclusion of Nazi racial ideology, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency in death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. The sheer scale and horror of the Holocaust challenge our understanding of human nature and the capacity for evil. The end of the war was a story of convergence. From the west, the Anglo-American forces, after landing in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, fought their way across France and into Germany. From the east, the massive Soviet Red Army, having chewed up the Wehrmacht, relentlessly pushed towards Berlin. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with the suicide of Adolf Hitler and the final surrender of Germany amidst the rubble of its capital. The war against Japan continued for 3 more months, a period of intense firebombing of Japanese cities. The final act of the war introduced a terrifying new weapon to the world. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was instantaneous and absolute. Faced with this new power and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japan surrendered, finally ending World War II. The war left a world in ruins. Estimates of the dead range from 70 to 85 million people, the majority of them civilians. It led to the fall of empires, the creation of the United Nations, the division of Europe and the dawn of the nuclear age, which would shape the next great global conflict, the Cold War. World War II did not bring peace. Instead, it gave birth to a new kind of global conflict, the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies against Hitler, emerged from the war as the world's 2 superpowers. But they were superpowers with fundamentally incompatible ideologies: capitalist democracy versus authoritarian communism. An iron curtain, in Churchill's famous phrase, descended across Europe, dividing the continent into a US-led NATO alliance in the west and a Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact in the east. For the next 45 years, the world lived under the shadow of this rivalry. It was called a Cold War because the 2 superpowers, each armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over, never fought each other directly. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, was a terrifying form of stability. A direct war was unthinkable. Instead, they fought through proxies. They competed for influence in the newly independent nations of the post-colonial world. They engaged in espionage, propaganda, an arms race, and a space race. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the moment the world came closest to the brink, a 13-day standoff that could have easily escalated into nuclear Armageddon. The first major hot war of the Cold War era erupted in 1950 on the Korean Peninsula. After World War II, Korea had been divided into a communist north, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and a non-communist south, backed by the United States. In June 1950, North Korea invaded the South, seeking to unify the country by force. The United States, leading a United Nations coalition, intervened to defend the South. The war saw dramatic swings of fortune. UN forces were driven back to a small pocket around Pusan, then launched a brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon that shattered the North Korean army. But as UN forces pushed towards the Chinese border, Mao's China intervened with hundreds of thousands of volunteers, driving the UN forces back down the peninsula. The Korean War settled into a bloody stalemate, roughly along the original dividing line, the 38th parallel. After 3 years of brutal fighting and trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, an armistice was signed in 1953. No peace treaty has ever been signed. The war was a brutal affair that left millions of Koreans dead and the peninsula devastated. It confirmed the US policy of containment, the strategy of preventing the spread of communism, and it militarized the Cold War, leading to a massive expansion of the US defense budget. The heavily fortified border between North and South Korea remains one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the world today. If Korea was the first major proxy war, the Vietnam War became the defining one for a generation. Like Korea, Vietnam was a country divided by the Cold War into a communist North and an anti-communist South. The United States, operating under the domino theory, the fear that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow, became increasingly involved in supporting the South Vietnamese government against a communist insurgency, the Viet Cong, which was backed by North Vietnam. What began with a few military advisors in the 1950s escalated into a full-scale war with over 500,000 American troops on the ground by the late 1960s. The Vietnam War was a war with no front lines. It was a counterinsurgency war fought in jungles and rice paddies against a tenacious and elusive enemy. Despite its overwhelming technological and military superiority, the United States found itself unable to achieve a decisive victory. The war became deeply unpopular at home, dividing American society and fueling a massive anti-war movement. The 1968 Tet Offensive, a massive surprise attack by communist forces across South Vietnam, was a military defeat for them, but a strategic political victory, as it shattered the American public's belief that the war was winnable. The US began a slow and painful withdrawal, and in 1975, 2 years after the last American combat troops left, North Vietnamese forces overran the South, unifying the country under communist rule. The war was a humbling defeat for the United States, a tragedy for the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and it left a lasting scar on the American psyche. Simultaneously, another region was a constant flashpoint of conflict, the Middle East. The Arab-Israeli wars were a series of conflicts fought between the State of Israel and its Arab neighbors, beginning with the 1948 war that erupted immediately after Israel's declaration of independence. These wars were driven by the fundamental conflict between Jewish nationalism or Zionism and Arab nationalism over the same piece of land. Major wars erupted in 1956, 1967 and 1973. The Six-Day War in 1967 was a stunning military victory for Israel, in which it captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. These occupied territories became the central issue of the ongoing conflict. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria, was a much closer call for Israel and eventually led to the Camp David Accords, a landmark peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, but it did not resolve the core Palestinian issue. The Cold War's final major proxy war took place in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. They expected a quick, decisive operation. Instead, they found themselves bogged down in their own Vietnam. They were fighting against a collection of Islamic resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, fighting a holy war or jihad against the atheist invaders, were supplied with weapons and funding by the United States, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. It was a classic Cold War proxy fight. The rugged mountainous terrain of Afghanistan was perfect for guerrilla warfare. For 10 years, the mighty Soviet army was bled by a determined and resilient insurgency. The war was a disaster for the Soviet Union. It was enormously costly in blood and treasure, and it demoralized the Soviet public and military. The humiliating withdrawal in 1989 was a major factor in the delegitimization and eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself just 2 years later. But the war also had a devastating legacy for Afghanistan, leaving it in a state of perpetual civil war and creating a breeding ground for radical groups, including one started by a wealthy Saudi Mujahideen supporter named Osama bin Laden. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was supposed to herald a new world order. The great ideological struggle was over. It was, as one scholar famously put it, the end of history. But history, it turns out, had other plans. The first major test of this new era came almost immediately. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded and annexed its tiny oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. This was a clear violation of international law, and the world for a moment acted in unison. The United States assembled a massive international coalition under a UN mandate to liberate Kuwait. The resulting Gulf War of 1991 was a stunning display of American military technology. The 100-hour ground war swiftly ejected the Iraqi army from Kuwait with minimal coalition casualties. It seemed to confirm America's status as the world's sole superpower, the global policeman. But the optimism was short-lived. The end of the Cold War's rigid bipolar structure didn't bring peace. Instead, it uncorked long-suppressed ethnic and nationalist hatreds. Nowhere was this more tragically apparent than in the former Yugoslavia. As the Communist Federation disintegrated, ancient rivalries exploded into a series of brutal wars. The wars in Croatia and Bosnia were characterized by vicious ethnic cleansing, concentration camps and massacres, most infamously the Srebrenica massacre, where Bosnian Serb forces systematically murdered over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. The siege of Sarajevo lasted for years. The world watched in horror, seemingly unable to stop the slaughter. It was a grim reminder that the demons of nationalism and ethnic hatred had not been banished from Europe. NATO intervention eventually helped to end the wars in Bosnia and later in Kosovo, but the conflicts left deep scars and shattered the illusion of a peaceful post-Cold War Europe. The illusion of American invulnerability was shattered on September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, orchestrated by Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda network operating from Afghanistan, fundamentally changed the course of the 21st century. The United States responded by launching the War on Terror. The first front was Afghanistan. A US-led coalition quickly overthrew the Taliban regime, which had sheltered al-Qaeda. But as in the past, conquering Afghanistan proved far easier than building a stable nation. The Taliban regrouped and launched a persistent insurgency, leading to a 20-year war, the longest in American history, which ended with the chaotic US withdrawal and the Taliban's return to power in 2021. The War on Terror expanded dramatically in 2003 with the US-led invasion of Iraq. The stated rationale was to disarm Saddam Hussein of weapons of mass destruction, which, as we now know, were never found, and to remove a brutal dictator. Unlike the first Gulf War, this invasion was far more controversial and did not have broad international support. While the initial invasion toppled Saddam's regime quickly, it plunged Iraq into a decade of chaos. A bloody sectarian civil war erupted between Sunni and Shia Iraqis, and a brutal insurgency targeted coalition forces. The instability in Iraq, combined with the later civil war in Syria, created a power vacuum that allowed for the rise of an even more monstrous terrorist group. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which for a time controlled a vast caliphate and unleashed a campaign of genocidal violence. The 2010s were further defined by the Arab Spring, a wave of protests, uprisings and rebellions that spread across the Arab world. What began with a Tunisian street vendor setting himself on fire led to the overthrow of long-standing dictators in Tunisia, Egypt and Libya. It sparked hope for a democratic transformation of the region. However, in many places, the initial optimism gave way to violence and instability. The uprising in Libya descended into a chaotic civil war after a NATO-led intervention. The protests in Syria morphed into one of the most complex and devastating civil wars of the 21st century, a multi-sided conflict involving the Assad regime, various rebel groups, ISIS and foreign powers, resulting in a horrific humanitarian crisis. And just when it seemed the era of large-scale conventional state-on-state warfare in Europe was a relic of the past, it returned with a vengeance. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest conventional military attack in Europe since World War II. This was the culmination of years of escalating tensions, including Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. The war has been a brutal, grinding conflict combining 20th century trench warfare and artillery duels with 21st century technology like drones and satellite intelligence. The Russo-Ukrainian War has shattered the post-Cold War security architecture of Europe. It has triggered a massive refugee crisis, caused global economic shocks and raised the spectre of nuclear conflict once again. It is a stark and bloody reminder that history has not ended, that the ambitions of great powers, questions of national sovereignty, and the raw, brutal reality of war are still very much with us. We are living through the creation of a new historical chapter, the consequences of which are still profoundly uncertain. So there we have it, a whirlwind tour through millennia of human conflict. From the bronze spears of Troy to the precision-guided missiles of today, the technology changes, the flags and the names of the empires change, but the fundamental tragic nature of war remains. And as I stressed at the beginning, this has been by necessity a selective and incomplete journey. And for every war we mentioned, there are thousands of others, each with its own stories of heroism and horror, each leaving its own mark on the communities and the landscapes it touched. The story of humanity is in so many ways a story written in the blood of these forgotten conflicts. The purpose of looking back like this isn't to glorify violence, but to understand it, to see the patterns, the echoes, the ways in which the decisions and hatreds of the past continue to shape our present. The grievances from the Treaty of Versailles fueled World War II. The proxy wars of the Cold War created the instability that plagues regions today. Understanding this long, brutal lineage is crucial if we hope to navigate the challenges of our own time. It's a sobering and often depressing story, but it's also a story of survival, of resilience, of people and cultures rebuilding from the ashes again and again. But this is just the beginning of the conversation. Each one of these chapters could be a series in its own right, so I want to hear from you. Was there a particular war, a specific battle, or a region whose story you found compelling? Are there conflicts we skipped over that you believe are essential to understanding our world? Let me know in the comments below. If there's enough interest, we can do a deeper dive to really get into the mud and the blood of these pivotal moments in our shared and often violent human story. Thank you for joining me on this journey.